My name is Dan Finucane, and I'm currently a regent. I love folk music, blues music, and I love singing and playing with other people.
My name is Ian Peoples. I'm a Jesuit regent. I'm kind of a football fanatic. Most of my weekends are spent watching at least a few games. I'm probably one of the biggest Lionel Messi fans. Welcome back to MagisTalk. I'm your host, Ian Peoples, and I'm joined by my friend and Jesuit brother, Dan Finucane. At the beginning of this month of November, as you are likely aware, the church celebrates the Feast of All Saints on November 1st. This is when we consider the lives of holy men and women who have gone before us. We look to learn more about their lives and consider how we might learn from their example. We also celebrate the Feast of All Souls on November 2nd, remembering all who have gone before us, marked by the sign of faith. In fact, the entire month of November, we take time in the church to remember our beloved dead, praying for them.
In our episode today, we would like to introduce to you a group of men and women commonly known as the Martyrs from El Salvador, whom we, as well as many others, find quite inspiring. Their witness to justice and Christian faith in response to violence and oppression provides a witness to each one of us. November 16th marks the 34th anniversary of the murder of the Jesuits, their housekeeper, and her daughter in El Salvador. Their murders occurred during the Salvadoran Civil War of the 1980s and early 1990s. This anniversary is one that has been kept all these years by Jesuits and our collaborators as a reminder that our witness to the gospel can lead to the ultimate sacrifice, the sacrifice of our very lives. The story of the Martyrs, called such because of their association with the Universidad de Centroamérica, or UCA.
Very good pronunciation, Dan.
Thank you. Located in San Salvador, is one that remains little known outside of Jesuit circles here in Belize. Yet it's a story worth telling. It's a story about how education can be a force for putting the gospel into action, how education can be a pathway for a faith that does justice. So let's start with what happened.
So on the night of November 16th, 1989, the 6 Jesuits were awoken by loud voices and gunfire outside of the residence on the campus of the UCA. Only days prior, members of the paramilitary had paid a visit to them, though at the time they had given no hint of returning. When a couple of Jesuits went to open the door, they were immediately led out into the yard and were killed. Each of the Jesuits were found within the residence and were shot. Some had their heads bashed in by the butt of rifles, their brains strewn across the lawn. And this act was later seen as a direct repudiation of the ways these men had used their intelligence to speak out against the government. It was a way of destroying the mind.
The Jesuits' housekeeper and her daughter, who were sleeping in a small room in the residence, were discovered by the paramilitary squad and were also murdered in an effort to eliminate any possible witnesses, or what they thought were any possible witnesses. And the next day, the bodies of the Jesuits, their housekeeper, and her daughter were discovered, shocking not only the nation of El Salvador, but the rest of the world. There was immediate condemnation from the United States and elsewhere. The killing of priests was seen as the crossing of a line, a horrific act that showed the depravity of the Civil War.
It's worth noting that the Jesuits and their companions joined nearly 75,000 other El Salvadorans who lost their lives during the Civil War in that country, and many of these people are anonymous in the eyes of history. Nevertheless, many have pointed out how it's fitting that the Jesuits, who were so vocal in support of the poor of El Salvador, joined them in their fate in being killed. Now that we know a little bit about what happened, let's look at who the martyrs were.
As we have mentioned, 6 of the 8 people who were killed were Jesuits. 5 of the Jesuits were originally from Spain, though they had lived most of their Jesuit lives in El Salvador. Some even entered the Jesuits as teenagers and began their formation in El Salvador, so they were in El Salvador for their entire Jesuit lives. The most prominent member of the community was Father Ignacio Ellacuría. Father Ellacuría was a well-known theologian in Central America who is a contributor to a movement in theology known as liberation theology. What this meant, to put it simply, is that he looked at Christian faith and our living out of that faith from the perspective of the poor, since the vast majority of Christians in El Salvador and the rest of Central America were impoverished. He wrote about these masses of poor people, whom he called the crucified peoples, as experiencing the crucifixion of Jesus by the unjust economic and political systems that kept them poor and violently oppressed. Because Father Echecuria sided with the poor, it put him at odds with the political and economic elite of El Salvador. Throughout the 1980s, Father Echecuria served as the rector or president of the UCA, the Universidad de Central America in San Salvador, and spoke out consistently against the violence of the Civil War and the abuses of the government and its paramilitary forces against the poor people of El Salvador. To end the Civil War, he believed, the causes of injustice needed to be addressed.
Father Ignacio Martin Barro studied social psychology and philosophy and was professor as well as administrator at the UCA for years leading up to his death on that night. His most prominent contribution to the UCA, however, was to found the University Institute of Public Opinion, which collected data on the attitudes and opinions of the average Salvadoran citizen. In this way, he sought to put his finger on the pulse of people in the country about the conditions they were living in.
Father Segundo Montes was a noted scholar who worked tirelessly to secure human rights for people in El Salvador and founded the Human Rights Institute at the UCA in 1985, a few years before his murder. He was noted as an advocate for his efforts to help Salvadoran refugees who were fleeing El Salvador during the Civil War in the 1980s. In a tragic twist, one of Father Montes's former students, Ricardo Espinoza Guerra, was the commander who led the death squad that took the lives of Father Montes and his fellow Jesuits in 1989.
Another Jesuit, Father Armando Lopez, spent much of his time as a Jesuit in Nicaragua prior to the Sandinista Revolution, before moving to El Salvador in 1984 to teach philosophy and theology at the UCA. He was also pastor of a poor community in rural El Salvador. Similar to the other Jesuits, he spoke out against the violations of human rights and dignity that was occurring in the country.
Father Juan Ramon Moreno spent a significant amount of time in El Salvador as a Jesuit, directing the Jesuit seminary and teaching as a professor at the UCA. He left El Salvador for some years to promote Ignatian spirituality in Panama, but returned to El Salvador in 1985. He was known by his love for the poor, and his desire was to be a pastor in a rural parish.
Finally, the sixth Jesuit was the lone native of El Salvador, Father Joaquin Lopez y Lopez. He was the oldest member of the community and helped found the Salvadoran branch of the educational organization Fe y Alegría, which he helped direct until his death in 1989. At the time, Fe y Alegría had over 30 educational centers for almost 48,000 children, youth, and adults who otherwise would not have had access to education throughout El Salvador. Along with the Jesuits, their housekeeper and her daughter were also murdered in November 1989.
Ms. Julia Elba Ramos worked at the Jesuit residence at the university as the housekeeper, beginning in 1985. Her husband, Abdulio, also worked at the residence as their gardener and watchman. Julia Elba and her husband had 4 children together. However, by 1989, only 2 were still living, including Selena. Selena Ramos was a high school student who was only 13 years old in 1989. And on the night of November 16th, Julia Elba and her daughter Selena stayed at the Jesuit residence, believing it would be safer than leaving campus to go home to their house. And when their bodies were found the next day, Julia Elba was wrapped around her daughter, trying to protect her from the barrage of bullets unleashed by the death squad. Abdulio, Julia Elba's husband, was the first to find his wife and daughter, as well as the Jesuits, after the massacre. So now that we've been introduced to the martyrs, we'll talk a little bit now about why were they killed.
The short answer to this question is that the Jesuits and their companions were killed because they refused to stop calling out the violence and oppression occurring in El Salvador. And similar to St. Oscar Romero, who was martyred in the late 1970s, their voices had a lot of power in the country. But there were different contributing factors that led to their murders, and we'd like to talk about 5 of these factors.
The first factor is that El Salvador, for centuries, had been a land wherein very few people owned and benefited financially from the land and its resources. About a dozen families in El Salvador owned nearly 90% of the land, leaving the vast majority of citizens in dire poverty. This was certainly true for laborers in the city, but it was especially true for the campesinos, the poor peasants, who in the majority of cases worked land that they did not own. As a result, the campesinos would work the land to pay the landowner whatever share was due for their being on the land. But if they could not meet those demands, they were indebted to the landowner, a debt that they had very little hope of ever repaying. During the middle part of the 20th century, there were attempts in El Salvador at land reform to redistribute land in a manner that was more equitable and fair. Such efforts led to a military junta taking over the government in the late 1970s to protect the interests of the wealthy landowners and to maintain their political and economic power in the country.
Related to these efforts of land reform was a second factor, a religious movement that occurred in the wake of Vatican II, which was in the mid-1960s. One of the results of Vatican II is that the liturgy, which had previously been conducted in Latin, was now in their vernacular language, meaning that the campesinos who were attending Mass were finally able to understand what was happening at the Mass. They were hearing it in Spanish for the first time. Additionally, prior to the council, priests in El Salvador would preach a message that went something like this: yes, you are suffering a great deal, but God desires you to offer your suffering to Him. You may be suffering now, but if you turn to God, you will receive a heavenly reward. Essentially, the message people heard was that God wanted them to be poor and suffering, or at the very least, that God was unconcerned with changing their conditions. And this was aided by the fact that most people did not even know how to read the Bible. They were illiterate and were not given the opportunity to receive much education.
After the council, however, priests, nuns, and pastoral workers began to preach a different message, expressing a new kind of theology. Following events from the Bible like the Exodus, people learned that God did not desire them to suffer such grueling pain and poverty. On the contrary, they began to learn from homilies at Mass that God desired to liberate them from such conditions, similar to the Israelites in Egypt. And not only that, pastoral workers out in villages and towns throughout El Salvador began to teach people to read so that they could begin to see for themselves the ways that God interacted with God's people in the Bible. They began to organize into what were called ecclesial-based communities, where they would read the Bible, reflect on it from the perspective of their lives and their social reality, and they would pray with one another. These communities became incarnations of a close-knit church throughout the late 1960s and well into the 1970s. Soon enough, the political implications of the gospel began to become clearer and clearer. People began organizing for land reform and for the full respect of their dignity and human rights, because they felt that doing so was grounded in Jesus' preaching of love, peace, and justice.
The response of the elites in the country was to castigate these growing movements as communist sympathizers, political subversives who were attempting to take over the country in a violent coup. By creating this narrative, the poor campesinos were cast as political subversives who were violently trying to confront the government. In the vast majority of cases, however, people were organizing nonviolently, and their aims were to promote their own rights. It was an example of a people beginning to find their voices, and the elites of El Salvador were deeply threatened by this. Following the coup of the military junta in the late 1970s, the government began to clamp down on any attempts at political reform being promoted throughout the country. People were being disappeared, some never to be heard from again, even to this very day. And this practice extended well into the 1980s during the Civil War. These violent and repressive tactics were meant to intimidate people.
A third factor that led to the Jesuits and their companions being killed that we need to consider, we've already mentioned, at least in a small way, and that's the witness of Monsignor Oscar Romero, who became Archbishop of San Salvador in 1977. Shortly after his appointment to that post, his friend Father Rutilio Grande, a Jesuit, was brutally murdered along with two campesinos in the town of Aguilares. Father Grande had been organizing the people in the manner we have been describing to promote their own dignity and their rights. And as a result, he was killed for his efforts. Archbishop Romero, as a result of the murder of his friend, became an outspoken voice for the poor of El Salvador, preaching the gospel of Jesus in opposition to the violence, oppression, and injustice that was occurring in the country. During his 3 years as Archbishop, Romero's Sunday homilies would be broadcast over radio, some lasting 2 to 3 hours.
I can't imagine listening to homilies, but maybe if it was from now a saint, I could listen to it.
Yeah, you think homilies are long.
2 or 3 hours.
These were long, and the reason that they were so long is because Oscar Romero would find out during the week updates on the whereabouts of people's loved ones. So much of the news in El Salvador had been co-opted by the government's tight hold that Romero became one of the only sources of information for what was actually happening to people who were being disappeared.
Romero's criticisms grew more pointed until on March 23, 1980, he directly called upon the military to disobey orders from the government to kill their own people, calling upon them to stop the repression. And if you're interested, you can look up these homilies and you can actually listen to this homily. The recordings are online, and it's powerful stuff. And it's for this act of direct prophetic action that Romero was gunned down during Mass the following day, dying shortly after being shot at the altar, celebrating Mass. Romero's witness to the gospel served as a galvanizing witness to many within the El Salvadoran church, including Ignacio Ellacuría and the other Jesuits.
So a fourth factor in the cause for the death of the Jesuits is that the Society of Jesus in the 1960s and 70s, following the call of Vatican II for religious orders to go back to their founding inspiration and mission, began to reflect on what the mission of the Jesuits was in the 20th century. Led by Superior General Pedro Rupe, the Jesuits had 2 general congregations or worldwide meetings of Jesuits in Rome in 1965 and again in 1973 to discuss this question of our mission.
The Jesuits were looking around them, reading the signs of the times, as it says in one of the documents of Vatican II, in places like El Salvador and in the rest of Central America and elsewhere in the world. And they were seeing that to be ministers of the word of Jesus Christ, to preach the gospel in the 20th century, meant seeking to address the structural injustice that kept so many of the world poor and oppressed. To preach the gospel of Christ and not address this injustice felt like it would do a disservice to our mission as the Society of Jesus. As a result, the mission of the Jesuits became the service of faith, of which the promotion of justice is an absolute requirement. And that's a direct quote, basically, from one of our documents stating our mission. To put it more simply, to live out a faith that does justice. That became our mission. And so Pedro Rupe famously said that if we truly lived out our mission, if we took it seriously in our ministries throughout the world, it would lead to some Jesuits giving their lives for the mission. His words were prophetic for dozens of Jesuits, including the 6 Jesuits who were killed in El Salvador in 1989.
The fifth and final factor for why the Jesuits and their companions were killed is how they conceived of the university that they ran. Led by Father Ellacuría, the UCA was transformed in the late 1970s and 1980s into an educational institution that didn't just issue degrees to graduates, but saw its role as helping forge the transformation of the country. The various departments and institutes of the university were put at the service of analyzing the social situation of El Salvador, diagnosing the structural injustices that plagued the majority of its people, and sought to address those injustices with solutions. And in the process, the university served as a place where young people were formed to see their education as not being about personal gain or even advancement, but about being at the service of reading the signs of the times and responding to those signs in society.
Father Ellacuría said the following in an address to the graduates of Santa Clara University in California in 1982. He says, "The university as an intellectual community must analyze causes, use imagination and creativity together to discover the remedies to our problems, communicate to our constituencies a consciousness that inspires the freedom of self-determination, educate professionals with a conscience who will be the immediate instruments of such a transformation, and constantly hone an educational institution that is both academically excellent and ethically oriented. To organize a university in this way meant that the university would inevitably collide with the elites and elite-led government, calling the economic and political systems into question that benefited those same elites. And as the symbolic and actual leader of the UCA, Father A.R. Correa was the vocal and visible target, representing the university's efforts to analyze and call out structures of injustice. It's safe to say that it's Father A.R. Correa who was the primary target of the November 16th massacre.
So now that we've talked a little bit about some factors that led to the Jesuits being killed, we're going to talk now about why the martyrs matter today. So Ian, I'll put that to you first, and tell us a little bit about why you think the martyrs matter for us today.
Well, I think when we look at martyrdom in the history of the church, it can seem like something that's far away. It can seem like something that isn't really affecting us today. But the reality is, and I don't know the numbers exactly, but I've heard different people say that there were actually more martyrs in the Christian church, in the Catholic Church, in the 20th century than in all previous centuries combined. And again, I would have to look that up. But then to look at these guys who lived up until 1989 when they were martyred, when they were killed, it brings the reality of the risk of faith, right? That when we decide to follow Jesus who was crucified, right? If we take up that cross, then it can lead to actual death as well, right? And that these guys, I think, ever since I heard the story of Monsignor Romero, St. Oscar Romero, who I have talked about before on the show, and the martyrs, I've been inspired just by their courage, right? And the fact that they stood against injustice, they called it out, and they knew what was coming. And so I think it's first and foremost, it really is, martyr means witness. I think it really is just a powerful witness of faith. That we can face death without letting the fear of death control us, even if we experience that fear. And I think that's just really powerful. So that's the kind of in general, but I want to hear from you a little bit and go back and forth with, I guess, the UCA martyrs in general. What is it about them that you think matters so much today?
Yeah, it's such a striking thing to think that, they weren't all university professors, but they were killed for being university professors. Mm-hmm. And that, what a strange thing, right? Mm-hmm. That people who write books, people who give lectures, who didn't wield guns, mm-hmm. Who were not concerned with being famous at all. Ignacio A. Correa is really the only one that people would have known outside of kind of Jesuit circles. So, mm-hmm. These were people who believed firmly in the mission mm-hmm. of the university that A. Correa really pushed, which was that the university could be an agent of change. And I think it's a different way of thinking about education than how often education gets talked about, mm-hmm. And I think, we talk about education as a way of bettering ourselves, mm-hmm. right? Of coming to, in some cases, being lifted out of poverty, mm-hmm. A way of getting a job, a better job, perhaps, than what's possible otherwise. And all that's good. But I think what A. Correa saw was that, reading the signs of the times, mm-hmm. looked around and saw, if we don't say anything about what's happening, we're really not doing this in a Christian way. Mm-hmm. That same talk that he gave at Santa Clara in 1982 that you quoted from, he talks about open your human heart and ask mm-hmm. the questions that Ignatius asks in the exercises. What have I done for Christ? What am I doing for Christ? What will I do for Christ? And he puts it, what will I do ultimately to take the crucified down from the cross? Hmm. And I think that those are all those are questions that remain valid today.
Yeah.
And as you were saying, if you start asking those questions, even if you're a nerdy professor, if you say them in front of the wrong people or in front of the right people, depending on how you look at it, it's going to get a response.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think in our context, at least our generation, we looked at education, or we look at, I think, even still, as a way, like you said, of maybe for an individual to get out of poverty, for an individual to maybe transform their lives. But to receive an education as a Christian, and especially to be educated at a Jesuit university, Korea thought became about social transformation, that education really is a vocation, right? It's a call from God to use the gifts that we're being given, right? The gifts that, education is a gift. And we know that because even here in Belize, right? I know too many young men at the prison who couldn't afford to go to high school, right? And so we know education is a gift. And if we've been given that gift, we're called to use it for building up the kingdom, right? That's the call of every Christian person. And so if we have these gifts of education, to especially use those, and for these guys to be in a university setting, but they were making enough of an impact that this violent, oppressive government was looking at them through the scope of their rifles, And I think one of the most powerful things that has stood out to me, I guess, just it's visceral, but the fact that they beat out they crushed their skulls, they cracked their skulls open, and they spread their brains across a lawn, right, as a symbolic act. Yeah. I think we both have. We've been to the Rose Garden. It's a Rose Garden now, that in front of the Jesuit community at the UCA, where these guys our brothers were martyred, and we've been inside the room, which is now a chapel, where Selena and Julia were martyred as well. And so it's just a powerful witness that here in this place, right, these people gave their lives to the fullest extent. So I think there's just so many things about this that it's so powerful. And when we look at the reason that they were killed, Dan, and I want to throw this back to you, we look at the global forces that were at work, right? Because it challenges us as Americans, because can you tell us a little bit about these squads and how they're trained?
Yeah, so a couple of things. The United States government supported the government of El Salvador throughout the 80s with money, millions and millions of dollars, but also armaments. So financial support, but also, as you're alluding to, the death squads that killed the Jesuits, but also operated elsewhere in the country. Many of them were trained in the United States at a fort in Georgia that at the time was called the School of the Americas, housed at Fort Benning. And now it has a different name, like Western Hemisphere or something or other.
Yeah.
But it was a place where people were trained from throughout Central and South America in tactics, in some cases of torture, ways of kind of counterinsurgency methods that allowed people to do urban combat, the kinds of things that led to the deaths of the Jesuits, but the 70,000 others.
That's right.
As well. So, and there were definitely people trying to appeal to the government of the United States, Oscar Romero being one of them before he was killed, trying to say, you need to see what's going on here.
Yeah.
This isn't what you think.
And this was an attempt to stop the spread of communism, right, exactly, in Central and South America. And I don't want to get into that conversation, but it's just to say that when our government is doing things that is leading to oppression and repression of people, we just need to be critical as citizens, especially if we're citizens of a democratic nation, to really be critical of what's going on in our government, to make sure that things aren't being committed, with the blessing of the country, that the people really wouldn't want to stand for. And I think this is one of those things that we weren't taught. And I went to a public school in the United States, and I wasn't taught that this was happening, that our government was training these sorts of forces. And I think if I were, I think it would have been troubling for me to find out as a high school student. And I know you having gone to a Jesuit institution, can you say a little bit about what the example of these guys was when you were a high school student, maybe?
I wasn't super aware of it as a high school student, but it was certainly something we talked about.
Yeah.
And this Fort Benning that I mentioned, people were going there for a couple of decades to protest, following the anniversary this time of year. And there were people that went from my school every year. And I think one of the years I could have gone was with Father Brian Christopher before he was Father Brian Christopher, just regular Brian Christopher. But it wasn't really for me until college, going to a Jesuit university, where I really learned who these people were. I remember just being wowed by whoa.
Yeah.
You can work at a university, but still also be a prophetic voice. And I found that really, really inspiring. How about you? How did you end up coming to get to know the Martyrs?
I think I first found out about them when I first began learning more about St. Oscar Romero, which was actually not until relatively recent. I remember watching the biographical film Romero, which is pretty good. I recommend. I'm sure you can find it for streaming online. But so learning about St. Oscar Romero, and then once I entered the society, hearing about these Jesuits who were killed, and again, I think what stood out to me the most was this example of these men who were so convicted by the gospel that it led them to standing in the crosshairs. And I think that's something, in growing up in a comfortable small town Texas, where Christianity is accepted and embraced, and it's actually maybe a little strange if you're not a Christian. The fact that standing for the gospel can get you killed in the world today, it shook me a little bit. And also, when I entered the society to where now I can call these men brothers, I think that is just an inspiration for me to really pray that I can stand for the gospel no matter what the consequences are. And again, I mean, Belize, I think this is a Christian nation historically, and but no matter where we're at, right? If we're standing against injustice, right, that's standing with the gospel, because Jesus did not sit back and let things happen. If he saw things happening, he would call it out, right? And we can look at something like when he went into the temple and turned over tables, right? Or when he, was speaking out against, when people were being mistreated for whether they're Samaritans or if they were not part of the sort of in crowd. So I think just standing for justice is something that really stood out to me with these guys.
Well, you've kind of answered our final question, but if there's anything else that you want to say, our final question is, why did the Martyrs matter to you? So, you've talked a lot about kind of seeing these guys as brothers, and how that's inspiring. How does that inspire you kind of in your ministry, or how in your, as you look ahead to your life as a Jesuit, how do these 6 Jesuits and their companions, how do they inspire you as a Jesuit?
Yeah, well, one thing that Ignacio Ellacuría really talked about was taking the crucified peoples down from the cross. And especially here in Belize, working at the prison, I think about hope a lot. And I think about how do we talk about hope with people whose lives are hopeless in a very real sense. I was reading today a quote from Ignacio Ellacuría when he said, "In El Salvador, life is worthless." And I don't think he was saying something that was, I think he was saying a fact about the country, that human life was treated as being worthless. when 75,000 people can just be snatched up on the streets and never heard from again, right? That's treating human life like it's worthless. And so when I say that for many Belizeans, especially our young men who are caught up in gang life, life is hopeless. I'm not saying that their lives are utterly without hope. I'm saying for them to be able to leave the gang, for them to be able to get out and change their life, it's very difficult to imagine. It's very, very difficult to imagine, especially if these young men have committed violence against others or have perceived to have committed violence against others. They are nailed to that cross, right? And there's no escaping it. And so I think a lot about what does hope mean for young men in this situation that, these guys at the prison, what does hope look like for them? Right? And that's a hard question. And so when I say life is hopeless, I don't mean that it's impossible for them to have hope. I just mean it's a kind of a statement of fact that these young men can't imagine a different life because they know they have a target on their back. And so I reflect a lot about what hope means for people in the situation like the guys at the prison. And so I think, how do I spend my life helping take these crucified people down from the cross, right? And it's a question that I don't have answers for right now. And it's one that I'll be carrying with me into theology when I go to study that more. A difficult question, but something that Ignacio Ellacuría gives me inspiration to really explore. So throwing the question back at you, why do the martyrs matter to you?
Yeah. I think they matter because in a way, it shows that kind of you don't have to be all that. Martyrdom or being a witness to the faith isn't something that you have to be extraordinary to do. I think about somebody like Joaquin Lopez y Lopez, who was not out there leading the charge, like Ellacuría was. He was out in the campo, out in the countryside, working with people, in educational centers for Fe Ellacuría. Is not a rabble rouser, and yet because he committed his life to working with the poor, because he was, guilty by association, it put him in a place where he ultimately did give his life. I think that inspires me. I think having had a chance to go to El Salvador several years ago and standing in the rose garden that you described and just kind of being present there and being in a place, being Catholic Christians, we make pilgrimages. There's something about physical space that's important. And I think for me, seeing the bathrobes that they were wearing in the little museum they have there, to me, it's tangible. You can touch it. And within the Society of Jesus, there's Jesuits who knew these guys and who are still around, right? Because this wasn't that long ago, relatively speaking. And so that it's tangible. You can touch it. Is inspiring for me. And for me, I've always found Ignacio Ellacuría to be a hero. I'm not like him at all. He was a very brash person. He was not afraid to really call things out. And he had ways of talking that were irreverent. He was not afraid to, I won't say some of them here because it would involve some curse words, but he was willing to really call things out and not shy away from saying things very directly. Yeah. And to me, it goes back to what you were saying about how Jesus, when he saw something happening, he didn't shy away from it. When I sit with that image of Jesus as being very direct, I've often asked Jesus, what helped you be that way? And he talks about just being very grounded when I pray about it, very grounded in who God the Father was for him, and just a very kind of trusting relationship there. And I think Ellacuría probably had that kind of relationship with God. If you try and read his writing, he's a very cerebral intellectual. It's difficult to read what he's saying. But the witness he gave, he was given multiple opportunities to leave the country, to go into exile to Spain. He was from Spain. And he did actually go to Spain for about a year or so when things were really hot in the mid-'80s. But then he came back. And I think that also is a witness to really to stay with the people and to not use being at an elite institution like a university to create distance.
Yeah. Well, that wraps up our show for today. We want to thank you for being with us, and we want to make sure that we would let you know that we're praying for you, for all those affected by the hurricane. We thank God that there were no lives lost, that everyone's safe. We're definitely keeping people who have either had damaged homes or lost their homes in prayer. Please pray for us. As of the filming right now, we're without power, but other than that, everything is A-okay on our end. So if you have any thoughts or comments or questions, topic ideas, let us know on Facebook or YouTube. And until then, we will see you next week. Thanks for being with us.